What really killed the dinosaurs?
What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're talking about the Aeldari faction reveal article for 10th edition Warhammer 40k. And this one is a doozy. These faction reveal articles have been kind of hit or miss in terms of the perceived power level of the factions and the abilities revealed. And the Aeldari not only looks incredibly strong, someone at Games Workshop absolutely loves the Aeldar super faction because this faction cannot stop winning, but also we get some inklings at what psychic abilities may look like moving on into the future of 10th edition 40k. So let's dive right in and talk about some detachment and faction abilities. Strands of Fate sees a return as the Aeldari army ability. In 9th edition, this was the Aeldar's ability to roll dice at the start of each battle round, and with the results of those rolls, determine a number of specific types of rolls, like hit rolls, wound rolls, advance rolls, for example, that you could turn into automatic sixes for the remainder of that battle round. Instead, Strands of Fate is becoming a lot more like miracle dice now from Sororitas, where you roll a die, put whatever the result you got in a pool, and then you have a selection of dice rolls that you can use that result to substitute in for later in the turn. However, the difference is how Eldar generate them. Whereas Sisters of Battle get them from losing units, or in some cases destroying enemy units, Eldar start with a pool of them. They start with 12 at the start of the game that they can then sacrifice dice to re-roll at the start of the game in case you get a particularly bad result. Whatever the results of these dice are get entered into your Strands of Fate pool, and you can then use those on advance rolls, battle shock tests, charge rolls, damage rolls, hit rolls, saving throws, or wound rolls. Just like the current incarnation of Strands of Fate, you can only substitute in one die if it's a multi-die roll, so you can't automatically make 12-inch charges or automatically pass battle shock tests. There will still have to be rolls involved. That said, there are going to be some other abilities that interact with Strands of Fate dice here that have been previewed in the article, and it looks like the Strands of Fate mechanic overall is actually going to be incredibly powerful. While only having 12 dice for the entire game doesn't sound quite as impactful as the previous incarnation of Strands of Fate, the interactions with some of the datasheets that have been spoiled makes it actually very strong. Now, to my knowledge as well, unlike Acts of Faith for Adeptus Sororitas, there is no restriction on the number of times this can be used. So, for example, if you have a model with a strong and vulnerable save, you can burn through the entirety of your Strands of Fate pool, passing every single one of those invulnerable saves if you really want to. It is a limited resource. There's very limited ways to regenerate them over the course of the game. So it is basically a once per game ability to do so, but given how annoying Strands of Fate are to deal with right now, I can imagine them being absolutely ludicrously frustrating if you're trying to kill somebody with an invulnerable save and they have a good grip of Strands of Fate dice in the chamber. That can be absolutely game-changing. And the ability to supercharge attacks with a bunch of 5s and 6s on hit rolls and wound rolls and damage rolls also allow low-volume, high-impact weapons to basically fully convert. Now, speaking of those low-volume, high-impact weapons, those big bright lances, for example, we do also have the detachment ability spoiled. This is for the Battle Host detachment called Unparalleled Foresight. Each time an Eldar unit from your army is selected to shoot or fight, you can reroll one hit roll and one wound roll when resolving those attacks. Now, for a little bit of history, this is basically referred to as Master Artisan's ability from the 8th edition Space Marine Codex. This ability was so game warping that almost every single Space Marine chapter ended up formulating themselves into a successor chapter in order to get access to this Master Artisan's ability. It makes low model count individual units hyper efficient. You're basically generating 2 command points worth of reroll efficiency every single time any unit goes to shoot. So if you have small units, in that case like land speeders for example, all of those could get a hit reroll and a wound reroll. There were several of these subfaction mechanics in 8th edition, and basically all of them were the best one that you could choose out of the available subfactions for your army. Armies using this ability typically tended to pile in on small individual model units like vehicles, characters, small transports, things like that, and just massed as many high-impact weapons as they could to try to convert them as efficiently as possible. And ended up getting nerfed based almost universally through 9th edition. I think the only versions of this ability that survived were in Knights. There were still separate effects, either getting one hit reroll or one wound reroll, or combinations of sub-faction abilities that could give you both, but at the expense of any of your other sub-faction abilities. So you always paid a high price to get this ability, but Eldar, just getting it back. That was one of the factions that really abused this ability as well in 8th edition. Eldar, at the end of 8th, was one of the most powerful factions between them and Adeptus Mechanicus, and they used this with enormous quantities of tanks. You would take 9 to 10 vehicles in an Eldar army, and all of them would get a hit reroll and a wound reroll, and that is looking like what Eldar are going to be doing in this new edition. So it is cool to see a super powerful detachment ability being showcased in this article. I am a little worried about the power level of this ability because it has been one that has existed in 40k before, and it has almost always been a bad idea. And with that, I think we will actually just dive into the weapon spotlight from this article right now. Usually we save this for the end, but I think that it's important to discuss the kind of weapons that can be benefiting from this detachment ability. And this one is the Prism Cannon for the Fire Prism. This thing has always had a either dispersed, pulsed, or focused lance. The dispersed pulse being a blast weapon, the focused lance being a more heavy-hitting anti-tank weapon. And the Fire Prism has always been kind of a mid-weight anti-tank vehicle. It's been good both at killing infantry and killing tanks, but not the best in the game. However, it makes up for that with some chicanery. It obviously can choose whichever type of ammunition it wants to fire, and when it's firing its focused lance, has had access to the linked fire rule. This has been a stratagem in previous editions of 40k, but now it's just an ability that's tied to the Prism Cannon. This allows it, when it's firing a focused beam, to link from another fire prism that your attacking fire prism can see. If you do so, you determine range and visibility from the other fire prism, not the attacking model. So basically, if you have two fire prisms with line of sight to each other, they can fire their prism cannon into each other's prism cannon and use that one to fire their shot rather than doing it themselves. This allows you to create a geometric web around the table of fire prisms that can link to each other. You can then fire off of a single one that is out in the open and allow the other ones to stay relatively safe. Now, you can't do this with the dispersed pulse effect, which is a 2d6 shot, strength 6, AP 1/2 damage gunshot with the blast keyword, so much better at killing light to medium infantry. However, the big headliner here is the focused lance. This is the one that allows you to fire through other fire prisms and shoots 2 times, hitting on 3s at strength 18 AP 4 for a flat 6 damage. Now, that profile is already impressive. 2 converted attacks kill most vehicles in the game, and you wound basically every vehicle that we've been shown so far on 3s, light vehicles like rhinos or storm speeders on 2s, entirely ignoring their save unless they're benefiting from cover. And on top of that, you have the unparalleled foresight detachment ability buffing that. So even though it's only hitting on 3s, you're most likely going to hit 1. You may miss 1. You can then re-roll that into a second hit and do the same thing for the wound roll. So your chances of converting both attacks is super duper high. If you need to as well, you can also sub in those for Strands of Fate if you need to confirm that you're going to kill something, and at AP 4, unless the target's benefiting from cover, you'll punch all the way through a 3+ save with no save allowed for your target. Unless your target has 12 or more wounds, they just die to 2 converted attacks from the focused lance, which, like I mentioned, is super likely. So that in and of itself is already a pretty powerful weapon. It also is compounded with the return of the Fire and Fade stratagem. The stratagem has returned in a new and improved version. It is used at the end of your shooting phase. It targets an Eldar unit from your army that can then make a normal move. Now, I don't know if this particular archetype is going to be one that's played very heavily in this new Eldar Codex, but it is one that we have seen played in the past. And it's the combination of using fire prisms and their ability to shoot through each other's line of sight and the Fire and Fade stratagem to essentially give your fire prisms a modicum of indirect fire. You can put one fire prism out in the open, draw a line of sight from that one to the heart of your opponent's army, shoot through it using your other fire prisms, then at last fire your initial fire prism and use the Fire and Fade stratagem to return that one behind a ruin or something that's line of sight blocking to prevent any incoming attacks. So you fired 3 fire prisms without having your opponent able to interact with you at all. Now, this is a little bit different in 10th edition. There are ways to interact with enemies in the movement phase. You can overwatch them, so there's a little bit of return fire shooting. Importantly, it doesn't require you to make ranged attacks anymore. Previously, it triggered immediately after you made your ranged attack. So if you didn't have any eligible targets, you actually couldn't use Fire and Fade. In this case, you just do it. Also, being at the end of your shooting phase means that there is some potential for reactive stratagems from the Adeptus Sororitas or Leagues of Votann articles that we've seen before come into play here and fire back at that unit before it's able to escape. However, it is a normal move, meaning it's going to use your movement characteristic, so these fast Eldar vehicles models are going to move 12 to 16 inches most likely, and they're going to be able to clear enormous swaths of the table. This stratagem is also great for getting models up the table. You can use it to double move models onto your opponent's objectives, for example, to steal them away with high OC value units. The only restriction is that you cannot declare a charge afterwards, so you can't use it as an actual threat extender. So that's a little bit of the taste that Eldar can bring to the table. And whether or not we see specifically Fire Prism Lances doing this damage, I don't know. It may just be that there are more efficient platforms for things like Bright Lances that are going to be able to be spammed by Eldar armies and make use of these massive numbers of rerolls that they're going to get. But we do have a couple datasheets being spoiled. However, they aren't necessarily of this mechanized variety. The first one is the Guardian Defender Squad. Guardian Defenders were always kind of a trash infantry in previous editions of the game, but it seems like they're being angled at being a little bit more of an elite staple. They retain their high movement value of 7, mediocre toughness value of 3, but decent save of 4+. And especially with a lot of saving throws on light infantry being reduced, a 4+ save on Guardian Defenders was not one I was really expecting. They do have it in 9th edition, and I think it's appropriate, but seeing units like Skitarii Vanguard losing points of saving throw, Guardian Defenders retaining their 4+ save was kind of surprising. They have an impressive leadership value of 6+, which is much better than their characteristic in the previous edition, and their good OC value of 2. It should be noted that their heavy weapon platform has the same saving characteristic, but 2 wounds rather than 1, and 0 objective control value. The weapon platform also has the crude platform ability, which destroys it if the last Guardian Defender model in the unit is destroyed. So you're incentivized to assign wounds to the platform itself at some point through the attack resolution sequence, so you can take additional damage on it before it's destroyed, before you assign the last wound to the last Guardian Defender. They have a wide selection of ranged weapons that can be assigned to that heavy weapon platform, from the Aeldari missile launcher, which follows the trend of missile launchers we've seen so far, going up to strength 10, but retaining their relatively mediocre 2 AP and D6 damage, or an AP 1 blast shot from the Sunburst rocket. Scatter lasers have seen a little bit of a debuff, going from strength 6 down to strength 5, which does make them a lot worse at plinking away wounds from higher toughness vehicles. Since a lot of vehicles will be toughness 10 or 11, that strength 5 will now wound on 6s. Makes them more of a dedicated anti-infantry gun, but even then, they're worse at killing toughness 3 infantry, which I think is honestly fair, because scatter lasers were a little bit pushed in the 9th edition codex. Star cannons have seen a little bit of an increase in power, going up to strength 8, but again, that strength 8 is only going to be really useful against lighter infantry. They're still going to win most vehicles on 5s, and AP 3 for 2 damage. We've seen the profile for shuriken cannons previously. They have the sustained hits 1 ability, so giving them exploding 6s to hit, but lose any rending effect. In fact, shuriken weapons, it looks like, do not have a cohesive effect anymore. It used to be that shuriken weapons almost universally got additional AP on wound rolls of 6, which would theoretically be the devastating wounds ability, but that has been removed. I think devastating wounds across the basic firearms of entire faction would be really, really powerful, so I'm not too surprised. But at the same time, it is unfortunate to see a pretty iconic characteristic of a weapon type taken away. The shuriken cannon itself, it comes in at strength 6, AP 1 for 2 damage, and the standard catapult is a 2-shot 18-inch range weapon that fires at strength 4, AP 1. Importantly, the Guardian Defenders hit on 3s with all of their weapon types. Not even the crude weapon platform hits on 3s with its heavy weapons. It's not relying on any heavy keywords to get that 3+ ballistic skill. With units like Skitarii Vanguard and Hearthkin Warriors from Leagues of Votann reducing their ballistic skill, this is another instance where Guardian Defenders have retained their high stats. Where a lot of other infantry in the game looks like are going to be moving towards more of a horde or cheap infantry role, where their damage output and survivability are being reduced, Guardian Defenders are not one of those. Now, the headliner here, I think, for the weapon platform is the Bright Lance. This is a strength 12, AP 3, D6 plus 2 damage laser beam. This puts it at a pretty good profile to wound basically every vehicle in the game on 4s or 3s beyond big super heavies, and being a single powerful shot means it gets the most benefit from that unparalleled foresight ability. If you have 10 Guardian Defenders with 1 crude weapon platform in the unit, you can use that weapon platform to use all of the unit's rerolls, plow a bunch of damage into a tank, and the rest of the unit can sit pretty on an objective. One of the additional benefits that they get from sitting on that objective is the Defenders of Fate ability. This gives you a new die to your fate dice pool at the end of every command phase for each objective marker that a Defender of Fate controls. So you can't stack multiple Guardian Defenders on a single objective marker, but if you have multiple held by Guardian Defender units, then each of those objectives will get you 1 strands of fate dice. This is almost identical and similarly named to the Defenders of Faith ability that Adeptus Sororitas have with their Battle Sister squads, which gives them miracle dice if those Battle Sisters are holding down an objective. However, giving it to a Strands of Fate roll is a pretty big deal, since unlike miracle dice, Strands of Fate don't have another way to generate additional dice over the course of the game as far as we know, whereas miracle dice are going to be being gained constantly as the game goes on. Overall, it's an interesting place for the Guardian Defenders, and it seems like they're being pushed as this small unit that can sit in the back. Being 10 models makes it difficult to battle shock them, and even if they are, they have a high leadership characteristic, so they're good at holding down backline objectives, and they can bring in that weapon platform to add a very reliable gunshot. Now, last but certainly not least in this article is a profile that we've been kind of itching at seeing for a really long time, and that's one of the most powerful Psykers in the game, the Eldar Farseer. With psychic powers being entirely rewritten, this will really showcase what we can expect from psychic characters in the future, and there are some hints that have been granted by the design team regarding psychic abilities, and it's not all that great. The Farseer comes in at a relatively mediocre profile, but with some incredible abilities. He has the classic Eldar move of 7, toughness of 3, and poor saving throw, as well as only 4 wounds, but a strong leadership characteristic of 6+. Interestingly, this means that he being attached to a unit will most likely not increase their leadership characteristic, but he does come with a 4+ invulnerable save. In melee, he's either able to use a strength 3, 3 damage singing spear, or a witchblade, which is 2+ anti-infantry, at only 2 damage. Either way, it's 2 attacks hitting on 2s, however, so not really the most exciting melee profile that we could expect. That said, he does have a selection of powerful ranged attacks, able to throw his Singing Spear 12 inches away at strength 9, AP 0 for 3 damage, and his Eldritch Storm is the psychic attack, firing d6 shots at strength 6, AP 2, d3 damage, but only hitting on 3s. This is a relatively uninspiring psychic profile, to be honest, especially given the immense amount of damage that Eldar Psykers can deal in 9th edition. This is a significant step down. Not having any really powerful keywords on it, like Devastating Wounds, for example, means that the Eldritch Storm is going to have a tough time punching through high armor saves. And at only strength 6, it's also going to have a tough time touching vehicles. It's wounding basically every vehicle on a 5, and a lot of them on 6s. That said, the power of the Farseer really comes from his special abilities. The first one being Branching Fates, which buffs the use of Strands of Fate. Once per turn, when a Fate dice is used for a model or unit within 12 inches of a Farseer model, importantly, it's the model, not the unit, you can turn the result of that Fate die to a 6. This gives you an outlet for your 1s and 2s. In a batch of 12 dice, you're probably going to have a lot of pretty mediocre rolls, and the Farseers give you a good outlet for that. Importantly, this is once per turn, but it's also once per Farseer. So, if you have multiple Farseers or multiple models with this ability, you can be using it both on your turn and your opponent's turn. Each Farseer gives you the ability to manipulate potentially 10 Strands of Fate dice, 5 on your turns and 5 on your opponent's, but multiple Farseers can allow you to do it multiple times, giving you a bunch of automatic 6s for damage rolls, for example, in your own shooting phase. The other ability that the Farseer have is the one that is potentially showcasing what psychic abilities will do in the upcoming edition. This is Fortune and allows you in your command phase to select one Eldari unit within 12 inches. No requiring keywords here, you can put it on anything. You can put it on anything from a big tank, a Cobra, a Revenant Titan, to an infantry squad. Until the start of your next command phase, it's -1 to be wounded by enemy attacks. You then roll a die, and on a 2+, it's -1 to be wounded until your next command phase by enemy attacks. This is a huge buff, but also at a little bit of a risk. Obviously, it's only a 2+, you can't Strands of Fate that dice roll, and while we don't entirely know if command reroll is going to work the same as it does in 9th edition, it's likely that it will also not be command rerollable as well. And we've seen this trend from way back at the beginning of the preview season when we saw the Orc Weird Boy. The Weird Boy has the jump psychic power. This gives you on a 2+ the ability to pick up the Weird Boy's unit and teleport it somewhere else on the table. However, on a 1, the Weird Boy's unit suffers d6 mortal wounds. Weird Boys have always had the theme of killing themselves and the orcs around them by blowing up their own heads. It's kind of part of the random fun of orcs. But we've sort of assumed that that was part of the Weird Boy's kit specifically. However, given that the Farseer's power also only works on a 2+, it's now looking like psychic abilities in general are only going to work on a 2+. Now, in the article, this also gets mentioned, specifying that Eldar Psykers don't suffer damage like other races do if their psychic powers fail. So the implication here is that most psychic abilities in the game are going to only work on a 2+, and on a 1, they're going to deal damage either to the Psyker itself or the unit that they're a part of. Obviously, the ghost helms that Farseers have made them immune to Perils of the Warp in the past, so that's not that surprising, but this is, I think, a little bit of an unfortunate way to implement this effect. Rolling a 1 on a d6 roll makes psychic powers significantly more dangerous than they were in 9th edition, where previously you had a 1 in 18 chance to perils on a double 6 or double 1, now you have 1 in 6, 3 times more likely. Aeldari specifically had a lot of ways to interact with the psychic phase and ensure that their powers went off, and it's looking like that may not be the case in their 10th edition incarnation. Now obviously we have a lot more to be spoiled, whether or not there are stratagems and command rerolls and things that can affect this, we just don't know. But if this is the format for psychic powers moving on into the future, roll a 2+, and on a 1 you take damage, without really much in the way of manipulation, it's going to mean that those abilities are effective, but it's also going to mean that they're highly dangerous. And that makes armies based around psychic powers a lot less exciting, especially given the effective damage reduction that we've seen from psychic abilities, going from dealing mortal wounds to actually rolling regular attacks that are not particularly highly statted. I'm a little bit worried about the position of armies with a psychic focus in the new edition. It really remains to be seen in especially articles like the Grey Knights and Thousand Sons, how these armies that are focused entirely on a now removed psychic phase are going to be implemented into the game. But it's already looking like the Eldar 1 is going to be a lot less psychic focused than it was previously. But let me know down in the comment section what you think about that. Are you worried about psychic powers becoming a thing of the past and whether or not Psykers will be even viable in 10th edition? And let me know what you think about the power level of Eldar in this article, because this does certainly seem like one of the more powerful articles that we've seen so far. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.